So you've got these two species that don't evolve. Humans don't evolve, Neanderthals don't evolve. And that's as far back as you can take the DNA evidence. But there's one other bipedal primate where we've got a lot of evidence, and that's Homo erectus. Many different specimens. And they existed from 200,000 years ago to 1.8 million years ago. But if you look at the fossils that are 1.8 million years old and compare them to those that are 200,000 years old, they're identical. So here you have a third species, no evolution. And this is the basis for a claim in Who is Adam, that God specially created all these primate species.
So there was an inter-species barrier so that there could not be any...
Yeah, Homo erectus did not give rise to Neanderthal or to humans. Australopithecines did not give rise to Homo erectus. What we see are 10 species of bipedal primates that have no evolutionary relationship with one another. And so this is why we've seen a complete overturn in the scientific literature. Whereas 10 years ago, they were claiming the descent of man hypothesis, first popularized by Charles Darwin, was correct. We now have adopted what's called the Garden of Eden hypothesis. And so that's the predominant explanation of scientific literature. They call it the Garden of Eden hypothesis because everything coming out of the new analysis is identical to what the Bible's taught about human origins. I mean, the DNA evidence now establishes that all of humanity is descended from one man and one woman that lived 50,000 years ago near the juncture of Africa, Asia, and Europe. And that's exactly what the Bible teaches. Even the date is consistent. If you calibrate the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, you get a date for God creating Adam and Eve about 50,000 years ago, the same date you get from the DNA analysis.
On the issue of soulishness, then, my second part of the question, I assume, therefore, Neanderthal did not get spirit injected into his body.
That's correct.
As with man, as man's body was created from the dust of the earth, his physical structure was the dust of the earth, was created from the dust of the earth. And then spirit, as I understand it, was injected into man, creating a combination of dust of the earth structure plus invisible spirit from God. Then it says, and depending on the translation, man became a living soul or man became a living being.
Right.
Now, is that a different kind of soul with respect to this animal soulishness?
Yes. In fact, you'll see different words in the original Hebrew. And again, it's a little bit tricky because in the English translations in the New Testament, you see the word soul. But then in the New Testament, it only applies to human beings.
What does it mean?
Well, in the New Testament word for soul includes the spirit, and so that's why it's never applied to animals, because it has a definition that goes beyond just simply being able to nurture and emotionally relate. But in the Hebrew language, they got this word nefesh, which can be used strictly to refer to creatures' capacity to nurture and relate, and doesn't apply any spirit dimension at all. So that's why you've got to be careful comparing the New Testament and the Old Testament. The English translated word soul is not the same New Testament compared to Old Testament. But with respect to Neanderthal and humans, you're right. These bipedal primates that preceded human beings did not have a spirit. They were like the orangutans and the chimpanzees. And we have evidence for that in what are called the cultural Big Bangs. That when human beings show up on the scene, we see this explosive burst of activity that we can attach to the spirit expression of humanity. And we've already discussed one. When human beings showed up on the scene, they're wearing clothes. Neanderthal did not wear clothes. I mean, Neanderthal was very well adapted for a cold climate, but humans were living in colder climates than the Neanderthals. That's because the Neanderthals were naked, whereas the humans were wearing clothes. And so they were able to quickly outcompete the Neanderthals through the application of clothing. But we also see other cultural Big Bangs. You see an explosion in complex tools, which again we've already mentioned, needles with eyes in them, fish hooks with barbs in them, whereas the best you see with Neanderthal is where he takes a rock and smashes a rock against another rock, gets a bunch of plates that they use to scrape meat off the bones. So that's Neanderthals' most advanced tool. There's a little bit of evidence that the late Neanderthals stole tools from the humans. But after all, we got monkeys that do that today. In fact, when I was in Japan, I noticed all the monkeys were carrying an empty Coke can around. And they would not let go of that Coke can. But the other thing we noticed is that there's this burst of a language, complex language expression. You see jewelry coming upon the scene suddenly. You know, no other creature has jewelry. It's unique to humans. And then we see the spirit activity, religious expression, art, music. All that's part of the brain structure allows us to engage in spirit activity. And when you compare the brain of Neanderthal with the brain of humans, the Neanderthal brain is as big as ours. But whereas they have a lot of brain structure to support their sense of smell, and we have virtually none, what we have instead is brain structure to support spiritual activity, meditation, mathematics, and philosophy. The Neanderthal didn't have that. None of the bipedal primates had that. They didn't even have the physical structure to support spiritual activity.
Are you talking about the cavity in the skull?
It's called the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is where all this activity takes place. And as you look at the skull of the Neanderthal, evidently there was no parietal lobe there, but had a very good sense of smell. Yes?
If all of the matter in the universe was created in order to support life on Earth and human beings, then is there a possibility of intelligent life on other planets in the galaxy?
Is there the possibility of intelligent life on other planets in the universe? If you go on our website, you'll see an article written by 3 astronomers who are part of our Reasons to Believe organization. And what we did in that article is lay out what the Bible would allow in terms of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. And I took the position that planet Earth is it. And I took that position based on going through the Bible and saying, God doesn't waste miracles. And how many planets does he need? How many species like us does he need to bring about the end of all evil and suffering? And my perspective is, one's enough. And if one's enough, then God's not going to waste creative effort on stuff that's unnecessary. Sam Connor, an astronomer at MIT, took the position that God appears to be compulsively creative. And as we look at all the life here on planet Earth, it seems rather extravagant. I take the position that no, it's not that extravagant, all that life is necessary. But he just sees God as just really desiring to create. And in one sense, I agree with Sam, that God really loves to create. But as I read Revelation 21 and 22, most of that creative expression is going to happen in the future. And maybe we don't need it to happen in the present. Nevertheless, Sam Connor argues that maybe God created life on other planets. And then when we scientists discover that life, that'll be even more proof that a God exists. Because after all, you can't get life from non-life by natural means. So he says, I think God wants to reveal himself. That's one way that he could do it. And then we had Guillermo Gonzalez, another astronomer, said, well, how about something halfway in between? Where instead of God making advanced life on another planet, he makes grass. And so we could have grass on another planet without cows and horses on it.
But
Where we all agreed was this, is that Hebrews 9 and 10 rules out the possibility of God creating intelligent spiritual life that is in need of a Redeemer. Why? Because Hebrews explicitly says that the Creator of the universe came one time and one place to bring about redemption. And therefore, this would be the only place where there's been intelligent life that is in need of a Redeemer. On the other hand, that could leave the door open for God making dolphins on planet X.
But you said even at a dime of matter, it would upset the balance. So if there's other intelligent beings, even not intelligent like dolphins, wouldn't you need more matter then to support their life?
Okay, when I said that if you were to change the mass of the universe by as little as 1 dime, I'm talking about the early history of the universe. If you were to add a dime to the universe today, it wouldn't make a cent's worth of difference. In fact, you could add several quarters, and it's not going to make any difference. You could add 1 billion quarters, and it's not going to make any difference. But in the early history of the universe, that's when the mass density of the universe is extremely sensitive. In fact, it's actually 1/10 of a dime. As little as a tenth of a dime is enough to disturb the balance. But now that we're into the future, you can use the mass of the universe to support as much light as you want. So it's not going to make any difference at that level. Yeah, I'll take yours next.
In the Cambrian explosion, there was just a huge difference of species. Like something obviously had to happen to trigger all that. Like, what was it that?
Okay, what triggered the Cambrian explosion? Two things. Just previous to the Cambrian explosion, we've got the solar system crossing a spiral arm. And crossing a spiral arm is really dangerous for any kind of advanced light. You've got dense molecular clouds, and you've got bright newborn stars that are blasting out radiation. And so we have the Creator waiting till we get past that spiral arm crossing event. When did that happen? About 600 million years ago. 575 million years ago is when you got what's called the Avalon explosion, and that's sponges and jellyfish. So previous to that, you've got bacteria and colonies of bacteria, and some single-celled fungi species. But once you cross the spiral arm, then we have sponges and jellyfish. 543 million years ago, now we're a good lead distance away from that spiral arm, and now we have all the phyla that we see on the planet today coming into existence. The other thing that's taking place is the sun is getting gradually brighter and brighter. As the sun gets brighter and brighter, that puts them into snowball events, ice ages that cover 90% of the planet's surface. An ice age today may cover 20 to 30% of the planet's surface. When the sun wasn't as bright, it was much more devastating. The other thing that took place just before the Cambrian explosion is called the second great oxygenation event. And that's when the oxygen content of the atmosphere went from about 1 or 2% up to a little more than 10%. And that extra oxygen made possible for the first time creatures that were bigger than 1 centimeter across. So that explains the timing. And the thing I noticed as an astronomer, the moment you got the oxygen, the moment you got the sun brightened up, and the moment you cross the spiral arm, God immediately creates all these light forms. And not in a sequence, he does them all at once. So that tells me that God is aggressively preparing the planet for human beings. Okay, in the back.
I was just wondering if we all came from and to explain different races as well as when intervening occurs today, why there are some disturbances or...
I didn't hear that last part.
Oh, just like when interbreeding occurs today, why are there like problems with the genetics there? If we all came from them?
Okay. Yeah, we do all come from Adam and Eve. And that's not a problem for explaining the races, because if you look at the different races at the DNA level, the differences are very, very small. In fact, the greatest DNA differences you see are not between blacks and whites or Asians and blacks. The greatest difference you see is between two tribes in South Africa, the Bantus and the Zulus. They have much greater DNA differences than what you see amongst the races. And so the fact that we have different colors really is very tiny distinctions in the DNA, which is why there's no problems with the different races and ethnic groups intermarrying one another. In fact, a friend of mine who's a geneticist is really concerned. He says, the rate of interracial marriage is so high on the planet today that it's going to make it impossible to do these DNA analysis of human history. Because the DNA analysis require doing DNA studies on populations that are extremely stable, where they have very little intermarriage or migration in and out of the population. And even now, we're kind of reduced to just 5 population groups: the Finns, the Estonians, the Jews, the Armenians, and the Japanese. Those are the only people left on the planet where we have enough purity within the ethnic strain that we can do this kind of DNA analysis. But within 10 years, that'll be gone. So we've only got 10 years left to do that research. So I don't know if I answered all of your questions.
I guess it's more of a conceptual thing. Like if we were from Adam and Eve, how are there so many different races? And
Well, my point is there aren't really that many different races. is that we're remarkably similar to one another if you look at the DNA rather than the outward appearance. And for that matter, it's interesting when you look at animals that like to relate to us, they can't seem to tell a difference between us human beings who are one color and another color. And I think that's just kind of the way species are. I mean, I look at parrots, and they seem to be able to tell one another apart. I can't, but they can. And likewise, we look at one another and we see huge differences, but you look at other species looking at us, they seem to treat us all the same. So, our variety of differences aren't that great. In fact, what I notice is we human beings are so similar to one another that we actually have to do things to our bodies to make ourselves look different. Maybe that explains the tattoo industry that's going on today. That we actually have to work hard to separate ourselves from one another. Maybe even look at this audience. You all got different hairstyles. And there's even a few out there that are kind of like me that don't have any hairstyle at all. So we all do that to try to differentiate ourselves. Our book, The Genesis Question, has got a whole chapter on the origin of the races. And actually what we do in that chapter is make the point that racial distinctives that we see in human beings cannot be explained by Darwinian evolution. Because the environmental pressures that would cause racial distinctives are at such an extremely low level that our anticipation is that we would have no racial diversity at all. What we're saying is there must be a supernatural explanation for why we have these separate ethnic groups living in different locations. But clearly, because of modern society, all those barriers are breaking down. But there's actually a segment in there based on Genesis 11 that's making the point that God had a purpose and is setting up these distinct ethnic groups and keeping them apart for a period of time. Okay, I think you're next.
A practical question. I have numerous friends that I take respect, who have fine Christian lives, who adamantly adhere to the literal 7-day creation. How do we answer that?
Okay.
Without going into this very complicated dissertation.
Well, it's not that complicated, and there's a book at the back called The Matter of Days that will give you everything you want to know about that and probably a whole lot more. But my first response is to make the point that as an old earth creationist, I too believe in a 7 literal creation day week. The point is that the Hebrew word yom, that's translated as day, has 4 different literal definitions. Remember I said earlier, almost every Hebrew noun has multiple literal definitions? And so I believe in 7 literal days, but I adopt a different one of the literal interpretations than my younger friends. The Hebrew word yom has the following literal definitions. Part of the daylight hours, which could be just this morning, all of the daylight hours, which would take you up to dinner time, a 24-hour period, or a long but finite period of time. They're all literal definitions of the word yom. And so you must look at the context to see which of those 4 literal definitions you go with. It's also helpful to recognize that in biblical Hebrew, the only word you've got for a long, finite period of time is the word yom. Notice that this is an English language controversy. You go to other nations of the world, it's no big deal. But it's a big controversy with us English language speakers. And one of the reasons why is I can count a dozen different English words for a long period of time. But in Hebrew, we only got one word. And so the English reader said, well, why didn't God use the word era, or epoch, or eon? Well, they didn't have those words. All they had was the word yom. And so the challenge here is to look at all 25 creation accounts and figure out which of those 4 literal definitions is not only literal, but consistent through all 25 accounts. The reason why I take the view that the creation days are 6 consecutive long periods of time is that's the only literal reading of the word yom that doesn't force the creation accounts to contradict one another. I mean, you've got contradictions even within Genesis 1, you've got contradictions between Genesis 1 and 2, between Genesis 1 and Romans, if you adopt this view that the days are 24 hours. And so there's one